I'm put in an exciting and somewhat uncomfortable position of being asked to talk about myself for an extended period of time. It is who I know best and also whose head I wish I weren't in all the time. But I'm just going to sort of tell you a bit about my background and how I ended up here. Peppered in will be some God stuff, the call narrative, as we say in seminary. And then I will hopefully be able to ask Joanne and Peter to share some of their story in the same way. And I'm going to sit for this, if that's all right with everyone. So, interestingly, yes.
Well, you say, what if it's not?
Well, yeah. I shouldn't. They're both very good with words, and I sometimes say things like that I shouldn't. I'm going to sit. Thank you. So, interestingly, my first memory ever is in a church. And I was 2.5 years old, and it took me about 25 years to recognize the significance of my earliest memory being in church. So I grew up for the first 2 years of my life in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And my family always attended the Episcopal Church down the street, Christ Church. And as a 2.5-year-old, I found the sermon a particularly helpful time to take a nap. And we had these beautiful needlepoint cushions on which to sleep. So my first memory is waking up on this little cushion and looking up, and this was a cathedral-sized parish. It was huge, and had, I don't know the architectural names, but there was a wooden beam across the front of the church with a nativity scene. And I remember looking up and seeing Jesus and thinking, that's really big and kind of cool. And then I think I went back to sleep. But that is the first thing I ever remember remembering. So my family always went to church. It was just a given. My dad had been the son of a Methodist minister who had a short-lived period as a minister. He quickly decided it probably wasn't the life for him. But church, I guess, was in my blood in that way. When my parents married, my mother said, you can go to church wherever you want. I'm an Episcopalian, and our kids will be. So my father got on board. Strong woman. So we just knew on Sunday mornings you go to church. That worked for quite a while until, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, sports and teenagers wanted to say no, and that's when I started pushing back a little bit. I need to sleep, I have a project, I have a game. Every once in a while my parents would bend, but normally they would take me begrudgingly. So I don't remember a time when church wasn't an integral part of my life. But I had no aspirations to do church professionally. Growing up in high school, I was really active in our youth group. So after Michigan, we moved to New York. So I grew up about 30 minutes outside of Manhattan. And we would go into the city to shelters and spent a few different weekends working with the unhoused population in New York. And I remember it was just so different from the really charmed suburban life that I was living. And I kept having these experiences and thinking, church is the reason I'm encountering these people. That's cool. Without church, I don't know that I would be meeting a man who lost his home because he wanted his son to go to college. That was the first one I remember. So I just thought, church is a pretty important thing I've got going on here. So it's a slow build to the call. Ironically, I was way too nervous to serve as an acolyte or a reader in church. My sister was an acolyte, and I said, absolutely not. I might drop the torch or the cross. My parents thought, no, you won't. That's ridiculous. But I was terrified. I had stage fright of church. So I happily sat in the pew or sang in the choir because I could hide behind many people. Eventually, made my way to Sewanee, the University of the South, for college, which is an Episcopal school. Again, God was probably laughing the whole time. Look at the thing that's most important to you, Winnie. where are you being called? But I refused to listen. So at Sewanee, my freshman year, I was just really homesick, felt out of sorts. I was one of the few Northerners at the school, so I felt like everyone else knew each other. And I found myself on Sunday mornings going to church, because at least that would be familiar. It helped that All Saints was beautiful and had an amazing choir and interesting sermons. So yeah, All Saints Chapel at Sewanee became sort of my home away from home. Eventually I joined the choir there for a brief period, the Guild of Sacristans, who are sort of Eucharistic minister and altar guild put together. I also joined a sorority, so often I would be at a sorority formal on Saturday night and then at 7 a.m. at church the next day. I like to burn the candle on both ends in college. And at my junior year in Sewanee, I studied abroad in Senegal, West Africa, which is about 97% Muslim, and then 1 or 2% Christian, and definitely a more evangelical, non-denominational kind of Christianity. So that was absolutely the most removed I've ever been from the church that I knew. And I thought it didn't even occur to me that I would miss church while I was away, but I did. I would wake up on Sundays in Senegal to the call to prayer, which was beautiful. And I loved that I was in a country that valued religion and that practiced religion, but it just felt so interesting that no one had the cadence of a week that I was used to. Sunday morning is church, maybe you spend some time with your family that day, and it just struck me that that I missed that, and that was a really meaningful part of my life. So, I don't want to talk too much and bore you all. If there are questions along the way, just shoot your hands up and I'll be happy to clarify or explain. Fast forward to graduating from Sewanee. It was 2012, so post-recession enough that we probably shouldn't have all said, well, it's really hard to get a job, but it was really hard to get a job. And through a connection of a Sewanee alum, I was put in touch with a church in Darien, Connecticut. They were looking for a director of youth ministries. And I thought, still, I don't want to do church professionally. That's not my job, but I really like teenagers. I had worked a little bit with youth groups. I remembered how much I loved my youth group. And they were offering me a job. And the alternative was to live with my dear Susan and Mike, my parents. So I sort of reluctantly took that position, just not knowing exactly what it would be. Darien is probably similar in a lot of ways to the main line. Very, very highly educated, mostly affluent, beautiful suburb. And kids there were very overscheduled, and church was not typically the #1 priority. So right from the start, I was sort of up against the resume, and college admissions, and why would we come to youth group if we could go to SAT prep? So it was a challenge from the start, and looking back, I think to be 22 years old as a youth director to kids as old as 18 was really hard. Am I a friend? Am I an adult? I think we were all trying to figure out how can I be a fun youth leader and also an authority. So it ended up being a tremendous 3 years because I learned so much about myself. I think I learned some leadership skills. I loved the people there. I had great bosses. So it was good. And at the end of 3 years, which was my commitment, I said, I will never work in a church again. The mystery is gone. Liturgy doesn't have that far away, beautiful, mystical feeling. It's just what I do. So I moved to Washington, D.C. and thought, I'm going to save the world. Somehow. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to go help people. And so I did that by living on my friend's couch for 3 months and applying to every job I could. And I ended up settling at United Way Worldwide. So the headquarter offices for United Way. And I did not end up getting to do the Save the World work that I thought. I was a grant processor, so I read a lot of financial sheets of nonprofit organizations around the world without any real training for that, which was frightening. But anyway, I was very removed from the good work that United Way helps facilitate. And so I just kept thinking, this is what I was supposed to do, this is what I'm called to do, why don't I feel excited about any of this? And once again, I found myself every Sunday going to church and finding meaning in that. And thinking, this is what fills my brain all the time. I think about the sermon after I leave. The hymn is stuck in my head for days. Why can't I get rid of this feeling that is church? So I remember after about a year or two of being at United Way and not loving it, I scheduled a meeting with the Associate Rector at the church I was attending in Alexandria. And he was a young guy, a few years out of seminary. I sort of had gotten to know him, and I said, I'm just scared that I'm supposed to go to seminary and I don't want to. And he said, I'll show you where the application is, you know? If it makes you that uncomfortable and if it's what you think about all the time, I have no doubt that's where you're supposed to go. And that's sort of how it happened. It was never, I kept waiting for this moment where God would appear to me, descend on a cloud. I would hear a just crystal clear voice, Winnie, you are supposed to be a priest. And I just kept thinking, if I can wait for that, I'll know it's real. But I think it was late 2018, I said, I don't think I'm gonna get that clear call, but I think since I was about 2.5, in some way, God has been tapping me, just very lightly all over, preparing me for this. And of course, the minute I decided that I was meant to do this, the moment I answered the call, so many people from my past said, oh, we've been waiting for this moment. Like, you could have helped. You could have told me that. People as far back as my childhood and like first youth group experiences, I remember a few parents in particular who said, oh, Winnie, when we took you on that first trip into New York, we talked about it. We knew you were going to go to seminary. So then I had to work through the irritation that it did not be clear to me earlier. But it worked out. So I started seminary at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria in August of 2019. The way seminary works, for at least in my experience, is my bishop in Virginia said, you know, you go through all this months and months of discernment to really figure out, is this what God's calling me to? You meet with various committees, you write a lot and read a lot. And at the end, my bishop said, you know, yes, we all support this, and I think that these are the seminaries that I would like for you to consider. And she offered 2, and Virginia was just it. When I was on campus, I thought, this is really comfortable, I'm excited here. And that proved to be true the whole 3 years I was there. I think I'm still missing it just a little bit at times, because I know their classes just started a few weeks ago, and it's that sort of back to school excitement. It was a strange time to go to seminary because COVID happened 6 months into my time there. So we did Zoominary, as we called it, for about a year. We never learned some of the practical skills. We just never were able to try out. We didn't have wine in chapel until I think my last month or 2 of school. So it was a very unique seminary experience, but I think it was the exact right one. I look at my classmates, at the experiences we had, what was happening in the world for the 3 years that I was there, and I think I could not have been anywhere else to go through all of that. So I feel tremendously lucky to have gone to BTS and now to be here. And even my sort of call to this church is funny and small world-y, if you will. My sister lives in Havertown. She's very close by with her husband and now 2 young children. They were actually at church this morning in the very back. My niece was the one who screamed a few times and was then silent because they took her outside. So my sister had started attending Michael's young adult group, the foundation, when he was still here, Michael Palmisano, mostly on Zoom because it was during COVID, and she just thought it was wonderful, and she loved the people she met, and had mentioned it to me a few times. And in the spring, she called one day and said, "Oh my gosh, Michael is taking an amazing position at Episcopal Academy, and wouldn't it be so cool if you ended up here?" I thought, oh no, I'm in Virginia, I'm supposed to stay in Virginia. Long story short, it worked out perfectly. I met Peter and we had some great conversations. I came and met the staff, Joanne and others, and just felt totally comfortable here. And it's weird and fun to be in a place where my sister might come to church regularly. I told her she's not allowed to come hear me preach yet. She makes me too nervous. I said, you can live stream it, you can't come. So give her a few more weeks and then that's allowed.
Is she watching now?
I don't know. No, as she said, I'm not coming to that forum, I know all this, I don't need to hear it. Yeah, so I'm incredibly excited to be here. So far, it's been wonderful. It's scary to do all these things that you've been training for and preparing for, but haven't had any real, you can't celebrate the Eucharist until you do it. And so, yeah, it's just interesting. I'm grateful to funny, supportive colleagues who are helping me through this, who know when to trick me and loosen me up before a service, and when to just be supportive. So, okay, that was so much of me. Does anyone have questions about what I've said so far, or seminary, or any of this stuff in general? Please.
Not germane to your call particularly, but why West Africa? How did you end up there?
I was a French minor.
I was going to ask, that's going to be my question.
Yeah.
Do you speak French?
I did. I definitely, it would be a struggle now. So I knew I wanted to go abroad, and in that sort of young, I want to see the world way, I said, I can go to France later in my life. It's not hard. Like, I mean, it's, you know, you can just buy a ticket and go. Somewhere like Senegal is just less Americans travel there. And so, you know, I had friends that said, where is Senegal? And had never heard of it and had no idea it was a Francophone country. And I just wanted something different. And yeah, I initially said Haiti, because as a young child, Haiti was the first country other than France that I knew spoke French. So I just had it in my mind that that would be a great place to travel. And then the earthquake happened shortly before I was studying abroad, so Haiti was no longer an option.
Did you ever hear of Quebec?
So my mother may have said that exact same thing. And when my parents came to visit me in Senegal at the end of my 5 months there, she said, France would have been so nice working with us. Mom, yeah. But it was cool. It was a traditional study abroad program. We took courses in French. I lived with a homestay. But then we got to do really cool things like go and spend a week with Peace Corps volunteers in central Senegal, which is very remote. There was no power almost in this whole town. And so it just offered me some experiences I thought were more exciting to me at the time.
If that was your minor, what was your major?
Political science, yeah, with an international focus. Because again, I was just ready to go save the world. But now I'm gonna save it in a different way.
The main line.
So, yeah.
Winnie, I'm just curious, how many students are there in a class, or whatever you call it, at the seminary?
It's growing a little bit. So there are several different programs you can be a part of. The biggest is the Master of Divinity. So that's what we all have. And in my class, there were about 45 MDiv students, and then probably 15 other degrees, Masters in Theology, Master of Arts in Theology. So yeah, at full capacity, we were about 150 students. So it's definitely a small community. And at BTS, every professor lives on campus, or just about everyone. So you're just very in each other's lives, in good and at times not great ways. I lived in a dorm, and so I was just never not with my classmates. We had our own rooms, but you ate all your meals together and worshiped together, and so again, it was fun, and it's really nice to come home to an apartment that's alone.
Yeah.
It's a very different experience if
Yeah.
you go to General Seminary where Joanne went, or I went to Yale Berkeley. Each of them is wildly different from one another.
Right.
So when you make a choice of which seminary to go to or which school, that's something you have to keep in mind. What are you really looking for?
Right.
And I don't know, Joanne, if you want to say something about General.
Well, the interesting thing was my first choice originally was Virginia until I went to visit. and then went to General and wasn't convinced that General was the place. Although as I was riding up on the train, I thought, well, you could commute if the schedule was favorable. And so I arrived and had a conversation with the director of Plan Giving, and then met the dean, and she was about to present me with the Penguin, which is the mascot for General. And the dean wouldn't let her do it because I hadn't committed yet. So I went on to chapel, and now I was beginning to feel more and more comfortable. Chapel ended, went to lunch, and a whole lot of students surrounded me because they were interested in who I was and why I was coming, and talked up how it was possible to commute. And now I'm really in a bind because on the one hand, I feel like I'm supposed to go to Virginia, but this place is really tugging at me. And I was practically in tears by the time I had to interview with the faculty member who'd been selected to see me. It was turned out to be my liturgy professor and my advisor in my first year. And I just didn't know what to do, but I felt that if I was this moved and this emotional about it, that this was the place I really was supposed to be.
So did you
Joanne,
end up
where is
commuting?
General? Where is
General's in New York, in the Chelsea neighborhood.
Can people that are studying to be an Episcopal priest go to any divinity school, or you can only go to ones that are?
Well, one could go to Lutheran at the time because they shared faculty and programs, but I think most bishops and rectors who are involved in guiding someone through that period of discernment would strongly, almost exclusively recommend going to an Episcopal seminary or that part of a divinity school that addresses those academic subjects from that perspective.
But there is, at Virginia, there were always 5 or 6 people that joined the senior class their third year as Anglican studies students.
Yeah, we had that too.
So so those are folks that, this past year, they had gone to Duke Divinity School, Princeton Divinity School, Princeton Seminary. Princeton Seminary. And one woman who was a classmate of mine who had gone to Catholic seminary, she had an interesting story. She had no aspirations for ordination because she was a devout Catholic and just loved the study of theology. And while she was in Catholic seminary, felt a call and ended up converting, coming to the Episcopal Church. And it was fascinating. And she was kind of inspiring. She had a family that is still very devout Catholics. They do not support her ministry, but she joined us for her Anglican studies year. And so that's where you're sort of just steeped in specifically Anglican and Episcopal tradition.
Yeah, I think we have, I'm going to go to call, because I think we have a very skewed sense of what that means. Kind of like the Isaiah moment where you have this sense of, who's going to go for me? Well, send me. And people want to hear voices or get some sign, and today's scripture was a really good reading for, rethinking our sense of call, because it's not like some sign is going to drop on the table in front of you and say, aha, now I know what I'm supposed to do. I really think of it as really a question of how much fortitude you have against how much resistance in order to go where you're gonna go, right? That all of us will have different stories about maybe going off on a different path, but finding that not satisfactory, and then kept swinging back. And then it's a question of going through committees and people who keep asking you, well, what was your sign? How did you know? When did God, call you on your cell phone? And you say, I don't have an answer for you in that regard. And then you have to kind of push through that, right? But I don't like the nature of the discerning of a call kind of language very much, because I think that then it creates two different classes of people. There are the people on this side of the table who've had some weird mystical experience, and then there are people on the other side of the table who look at us for having a weird mystical experience, right? And, it's really, we're all in the same work, Christianly speaking. It's just a question of where does that work take you, and how do you want to make it manifest? And then for each of us, I think we have a slightly different story about, what's important and why, and what is it that's compelling about church. And I have these moments all the time where I realize what's compelling. You said something about when the liturgy loses its mystery and you're stuck in you're in the kitchen making the stew, so you know too much about how it all gets put together. But there is still a moment, almost every single time we have a service, where I look out and I look at the people who are there, and I think, okay, this is the real thing. As long as I've got people there, you can go through all the words, you can go through all the text, you can go through all the tradition, you can go through all the different robes and stoles and the things that are done and all that kind of stuff. And it can be very interesting. But at the end of the day, for me, it's that church is a place where you have the most opportunity to connect with individuals in a way that is deeply meaningful and enduring. It just sets that kind of stage, for good and for ill.
Yeah.
Right? But I realized along my way that I needed to find that kind of context, and then try to live it, and then try to invite people into it. And that's how I thought of all that kind of strange language of call and discernment.
Peter, to your point of call, though, I've had two calls. I felt called to be a lawyer for many reasons, largely because I came along when the civil rights movement had real power and force to it, and it hadn't been taken over quite yet by the lawyers. But I felt called to it, and I was a lawyer for 30 years, 30, 35, something like that. Along the way, I experienced another call that I in turn answered. So I think on both sides, people are called to do what they feel they are the person to be. And that one phase I felt I was the person to be a lawyer, and another phase I felt called to be a priest.
Come Judgment Day, can I hire you?
Believe me, even at my best, it would not help.
John, why did you leave the law?
The other call was gaining primacy in my life, and it wasn't quite as fulfilling. I think I'd become a transactional attorney. That was okay. It was fine when I worked for a public body, because then there was a larger purpose to serve. But more and more, smaller people took larger positions and sort of blocked out that sense of public service because they wanted to have all the power and grandeur themselves. And it's very hard to serve the common good working with someone like that.
Libby.
Libby?
Yep, I'm Libby Van Dusen. I want to sort of speak for everybody here that isn't a priest, and whether we have a call. When I was in graduate school, it was before women were allowed to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. the most you could do professionally in the church was to be a director of Christian education or something like that. But I did study theology, and I went through kind of a period of wondering whether I had a place in the church professionally. And I struggled with this. I finally went on a retreat. I decided if I didn't receive a call, it would mean I didn't have one. But I was sort of hoping that I would hear this voice. And to my astonishment, I actually did come away with a very strong conviction that I was to be a lay person. And it isn't just as a clergy person that you have a call, that God has work for the laity, and you can definitely feel that this is what you're supposed to do. No details about what I might do professionally. I end up teaching math, but that's beside the point. But I just think it isn't just a call to be a priest that is a valid call, the way it's sometimes perhaps.
Well, that's very true, Libby, and from personal experience, you keep me honest, which is, and I mean that very seriously, because whatever I say, you think about and you respond with real education and understanding and discernment, and that creates a really good, sometimes foil, right? I mean, and it's a test, and it's a great thing, and every congregation should have people like that. That's what we hope for, because it's only in that work that we share together that we get anywhere. And it's certainly not the case that ministry should be a group of select people telling everybody else how they should be. Right? It's a whole community kind of engagement, and so we are just as dependent on you as you might ever think that you might be dependent on us.
In some senses, more. We're more dependent on you.
And just to be the fresh out of seminary nerd who loves the catechism in our prayer book, who are the ministers of the church? Laypersons are listed first. And what is the ministry of the laity? That is listed before any of the ordained orders. So absolutely, power to the laity, really.
I apologize, I haven't had a chance to meet you, Winnie, but my dad was rector here for 20 years in the 70s and 80s, and some of you will remember him. But his call, I thought, might interest a couple of people. This other element that hasn't been talked about was that of fear. And my dad had one of fear, in that he was a government major in college, like political science. He ended up going to Virginia Theological Seminary, and he loved Sewanee. Tried to get my daughters to go there. But in the meantime, he graduated from college and went up to Nova Scotia and bought a little tiny schooner that was half the size of this room, 30-foot long schooner. And he sailed it single-handed down the East Coast to Key West. And this was in the late 40s, long before GPS and LORAN and radar. So he was out there with a compass and a chart, all by himself. And many times, I don't know, many of you have been out in a boat in the middle of the ocean, but it is terrifying. And along the way, a number of storms, and he said, and many of them, God, get me through this, and I will serve you. And despite being a government major, he got off that boat in Key West, right to Virginia Theological Seminary. Wow. Never looked back. So that was his story.
Give your name, John.
John Pickering, and Tim Pickering was the rector here for a long time. So.
I do what you just described.
A lot of people say that on boats, but then don't follow through with it.
Right. Exactly. Well, I joke that I would have gone to seminary a few years earlier if public speaking weren't a part of ministry.
Yeah.
So that was my bit of fear, but it doesn't quite compare to single-handedly sailing down the way.
Yeah, and I'm gonna leap off and off something that Libby said, right? That It's not that there are just priests and lay people. I also want to say it's not just that there's church and then everything else, right? That when I think back about what it is that led me toward what I'm doing now, a big piece of that, not exclusively, but a big piece of it was I spent my entire childhood fairly alone and unscheduled when I wasn't in school. And the way I spent that time was I would walk or ride my bicycle everywhere. And I would just soak in the world. That's how I just thought about it. Whether I was walking through the woods or walking through neighborhoods, I was always observing and thinking about what was going on. And to this day, I still say that to walk is to move at the pace of thought, which is something that I love. If you're in a car and you're zipping down the road, you don't have a chance to think about what you're passing. You can observe quickly, but you're constantly moving on, right? The beautiful thing about walking is that you can notice things and start to think about them. And you have a chance to think about them in depth. And I spent my childhood not playing soccer, not playing lacrosse, not playing all these sports, not racing around to this, that, and the other thing. Getting, as you said, everything stacked up on my resume. I spent it walking and thinking, literally. And that opened the world to me in a way that I wanted to try to continue. And there was nothing that spoke that language as well as in my perspective, as being engaged in the worshiping community, which is asked to be deeply attentive across the spectrum. Joanne spoke this morning on the story of Lazarus, right? The one you don't want to see, right? Or the one that many people don't see. And as Christians, the texts compel us to these realizations that we wouldn't have in any other way. And I continually feel that to this day, and that's why I love what I do. But that's a whole work of ministry for everybody. And a lot of that work goes on well outside the walls here, well outside the structured worship that happens and so on. It's a kind of living of life. I always want to say, how deeply do you want to look? That's just my question. How deeply do you want to look?
Isn't this all an awareness of God working in our lives? It all comes together, doesn't it?
I will likely use this at some point in a sermon, so you're getting a sneak peek. But I was in college, somebody gave me the visual for God of a huge spider web, the web itself, and every person on earth is on that spider web.
Yeah.
And that just changed the whole way I saw who God is and what we are so intertwined. And we say that, but for me to visualize it in that way, to think, if I'm the rich man and Lazarus is right there, we can be as different as possible in every way of the world, but we're both on the spider web, and you just can't deny that. And so when somebody told me that, I sort of thought, I want to help people see that web. And that's something that lay people, ordained people, anyone can understand and can help direct people to. It's not just we all need to love each other because we're all living on earth together. It's like, no, God has literally created a world in which we all cannot remove ourselves from each other. And so that just compels me to care about people, sometimes more than I want. I mean, honestly, it's exhausting to think about this stuff all the time and sort of feel compelled to look at the world this way, but it's also opened my eyes up, and I think Charles Taylor writes beautifully about enchanting the world with God. You just see the world differently. It sparkles more if you see God through it all.
And because of that web, there can be some really startling experiences. My mother died a month before I graduated from college. And that summer, when I was grieving the hardest, was really, really difficult. And I remember being near the church that I grew up in Baltimore, St. James. I was walking down the street, and there were a number of people walking towards me whom I sort of didn't see. But one woman came right up to me and she saw somehow deep inside of me the grief that I was carrying. And she asked me to come to her apartment because she figured I needed to talk to someone. So she very much ministered to me that day. And I don't know what it is she saved me from, but she did. And I think any of us can have those unexpected, jewel kind of encounters that alter our path in life. But it's also a different kind of moment of calling and ministry.
One last question, and because it's 11:30,
Yeah.
and then you're happy to take questions well into the
Absolutely,
afternoon, right?
correct.
Could you please expand on your prior question? How deeply do you want to look?
What was the question?
Yeah, well, expand on the question of how deeply do I want to look, you know, a quick answer. I wrote a meditation for last Friday on Psalm 88, which is a psalm of despondency, right? And if you read the psalm, it can be kind of, on the face of it, kind of exhausting right out of the gate. Everything is going wrong. God seems not to be speaking. The world is going to hell. And what do you do, right? And the psalmist pleads for help in this, and he talks at length about, and there's this that's wrong, and this that's wrong, and this that's wrong, and this that's wrong. And my contention is that you can look at all of that, but as long as you have the impulse to cry out to God, that is still more an expression of hope than one of despondency, right? And I decided I wanted to make my life opening that lens as much as I could to not see that despondency, because then I wouldn't know that hope, right? And there are a lot of people who can live, and I think this was to your point too about the character in the story today, who can live these very small, I would call them kind of anesthetized lives, right? That there's not a lot moves, not a lot is shaken, not a lot is frustrating, very easy. It's like Amos saying, yeah, we're just lying on our beds and eating the fat of the land, and isn't this great, right? And I want to say, as you did too, that there is a certain poverty in that. And the poverty is not seeing the expansiveness of the world. I mean, to John, to your point about your dad, and being out in the ocean and knowing that fear, right? And the immensity of nature and feeling very small in the midst of that. But you're still in the midst of that, right? And you still have this voice that calls out. And I somehow along the way had a lot of different experiences, a lot of different neighborhoods, a lot of different populations, a lot of different troubles, saw things that most of you wouldn't believe if I told you that I saw them and experienced them. But through it all, I kept finding that the best way to acknowledge that difficult existence and the best way to deal with that difficult existence was to be able to bring all of that into my faith life and into the sense of song and trust and confidence and hope that can come through the midst of it, right? Because that, I think, holds everything together, right? It takes all those people in, rather than just saying, I don't care, right? And I looked at a lot of people who have great power in this world, for whom other people are just fodder, right? And that's being played out right now to great travesty. And you look at that and you say, how can it be that there's going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be killed because certain individuals have a vision of the power that they want to maintain, and it doesn't matter to them how many people live their lives. I don't want to live in that impoverished world. I want to live in a world where all of those things matter, and you find your way through. And for good and for ill, we raise our voices to God in that regard. Again, that's what I was trying to say.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
You're freshly amended, so.
That's a great way to, no, I want to end on that eloquence because I'll just, and rude. That's really beautiful. And this was fun for me because I knew I would talk about myself, but then I wanted to hear from them because I think this stuff is so expansive and also so weird. Again, this whole idea of listening for God's voice and the call, it's odd, and so it's fun to hear different voices share their understandings of it from all perspectives, like ordained and everything. So thank you all for being here and for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So nice to see you. We'll have to find a way to get together.